My name is Renee Englot. I was first introduced to tales back in 2005 at the Tales Fort Edmonton Storytelling Festival. During one of the festival workshops, I began to think seriously about doing something with storytelling. By 2008, I was part of the festival committee, and from 2012 to 2016, the executive producer. This video series is a great way to celebrate Tales' 40th anniversary. As my anniversary offering, I'd like to share a story I've been wanting to tell for quite some time. I call it Previously. Dr. James Barry had let it be known that he did not wish to be washed for burial. He wanted to be buried in whatever he happened to be wearing. Yet, when the time came in July of 1865, a laying out woman was summoned. She stripped the body and discovered that Dr. James Barry of the British Army was a woman. Previously, Dr. James Barry had been the Army's Inspector General of Hospitals for Canada. There they had instituted the type of reforms they were famous for: greater cleanliness, more varied diet, improvements to drainage and sewage, the provision of proper mattresses. Dr. Barry had even made the radical proposal that perhaps soldiers' wives shouldn't be accommodated in the barracks, forced to live among large numbers of unmarried men. Dr. Barry had been sent to Canada in hopes the climate might cool their temper. Previously, Dr. James Barry had been the Deputy Inspector of Hospitals at Corfu in the Mediterranean during the Crimean War. There, they were arrested for striking a colonel across the face with a riding crop. Previously, Dr. Barry had protested the unnecessary drilling of troops on the parade square in extreme heat. It led to an increase in hospitalizations for heat stroke. A colonel had ignored them. One day, tiny Dr. Barry lambasted the colonel in their squeaky voice, brandishing their riding crop for emphasis. Because the two were of equivalent rank, and because allowances were made for tempers shortened by the stress of war, Dr. Barry was released. But, dear listener, this wasn't the first time Dr. Barry had been arrested. Previously, at St. Helena, they had refused to certify that a perfectly healthy captain was so medically unfit that he must be returned to England. Instead, it was Dr. Barry who was returned to England to face trial for calling the character of a superior officer into question. Luckily, back in London, the charges were quickly thrown out. But that still wasn't the first time Dr. Barry had been arrested. Previously, they had been court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. When a military official refused to furnish the supplies Dr. Barry needed to run the hospital, Dr. Barry had gone over the other officer's head and written directly to the Secretary of State. A definite no-no. Fortunately, Dr. Barry was fully and honorably acquitted of conduct unbecoming. Although that was the first time Dr. Barry was arrested, it certainly wasn't the first time they had come under great public scrutiny. At their first overseas posting in the Cape Colony in southern Africa, an anonymous person had posted a sign alleging that Dr. James Barry was in a same-sex relationship with the married governor of the colony. Close, but not quite. The governor and later his equally influential brothers were strong supporters of James. Their power and influence opened many doors for the doctor, and on more than one occasion, it kept the doctor out of trouble. Did I mention the duel? Oh yes, there was a duel. Dr. Barry whipped off their belt, applying it as a tourniquet, waving off the surgeon, who would no doubt have cut away Barry's breeches to expose the wounded thigh. Previously, perhaps in an attempt to seem one of the guys, Dr. Barry had made a joke of a sexual nature about a superior officer and a woman not his wife. Another officer had demanded that Barry retract their words. Barry refused. The other officer pulled Barry's nose. Grossly insulted, the red-headed, Irish, hot-tempered person had two options: brawl or duel. Standing at just 5 feet tall, even in their platform boots, Barry opted for duel. Despite the fact that the other officer was combat trained. Both were wounded, neither seriously, and in fact, the two remained close. Barry was passionate and devoted to good medicine. They made radical reforms to hospitals, leper colonies, and prisons that were often unsanitary and inhumane. They spoke truth to power. Their dedication to cleanliness before the germ theory of disease probably saved many of their patients. They were one of the first to perform a cesarean in which both mother and infant survived. Previously, newly educated and board certified, James Barry, MD, had joined the army. Doctors were officers, and as gentlemen, they weren't subjected to a medical examination. Their word that they were healthy was deemed sufficient. Nevertheless, it was risky. But a guaranteed steady income, the opportunity to see the world, the chance for adventure. Perhaps it seemed a more direct career path than trying to make a living in private practice with patients who could afford to pay, especially as Dr. Barry had very few connections to wealth and privilege. Getting a medical degree hadn't been easy. There was debt. They couldn't afford to care for the poor. They needed to get out of poverty themselves. Their identity had been called into question, too. The university had determined that James Barry couldn't be the man they claimed to be. No. James Barry must be a boy genius, not even reached the age of puberty. They were forced to go along with it and adjust their age accordingly. Previously, Margaret Ann Bulkley had tried to find a job as a governess or a companion to a rich old lady. Even that had required they update their education. A governess was expected to have excellent grammar, to be fluent in French and preferably Italian as well, to have a knowledge of geography and history, to be able to play the pianoforte, draw, and sing. Luckily for Margaret Ann, her late uncle had been a well-known, though impoverished, artist, and he had a few wealthy patrons who were willing to assist Margaret Ann in acquiring the requisite education. But still the jobs weren't forthcoming. And so a scheme was hatched amongst Margaret Ann, their mother, and a couple of those wealthy patrons of her late uncle. Margaret Ann Bulkley would become James Barry, and would attend the Edinburgh Medical School. It seemed that, or the streets. Previously, Margaret Ann, their mother and sister, had been homeless, forced to rely on the kindness of friends, failed by the men in their lives. Margaret Ann's father had made some very questionable financial decisions and had run away to avoid debtor's prison. Margaret Ann's brother had dropped out of university, blown his share of the family funds, and sold the property that had been meant to secure the futures of his mother and sisters. Margaret Ann's uncle, the artist, had refused to sign over a deed of property to Margaret Ann despite having promised to do so. And another uncle had done worse. Aged approximately 13, Margaret Ann Bulkley gave birth to a baby girl and handed her over to their mother to raise. Previously, Margaret Ann had been an innocent girl on the streets of Cork, staring in wonder at the soldiers in their glorious red uniforms, wondering why they couldn't be a soldier too.